Part 2 of the second number of Art in Australia, 1917. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Some Recollections of Charles Conder by Julian Ashton. Illustrated by The Farm, Richmond, New South Wales. Oil painting in the possession of Julian Ashton, Esquire, Sydney. Charles Conder came to Sydney in 1885, at the age of 17. He was sent out by his people in London to learn under an uncle, a trigonometrical surveyor in the Lands Department, the method of dividing the surface of New South Wales into rods, poles, and perches. But a more alluring vocation, the quest of beauty, filled his mind and stirred his senses, and in the following year he left his uncle's survey camp for good and came back to Sydney. Of medium height, rather heavy build, with a polite, even deferential manner, he had curious moods of abstraction, which marked him even in those early days as a dreamer of dreams. Upon the subject of painting his interest never flagged, and his curiosity as to modes of procedure was indefatigable. He secured a small position upon the Illustrated Sydney News, at a salary which sufficed his sturdy bohemianism. He was very careless as to what materials he used. Most of his work was done upon cigar boxes, or any piece of cardboard coated with size. He had an extraordinary sense of colour and tone, but his appreciation of form was most primitive. When I first visited his studio, he was living in William Street, Darlinghurst, where he enjoyed a careless existence, eating when he felt like it and working at all hours, as the mood took him. Dressed anyhow, with wisps of long hair hanging over his forehead, and a cigarette for ever drooping from the corner of his mouth, Charles Conder looked the embodiment of one of the heroes of his favourite reading at that time, Murger's La Vie de Bohème. Amid the disorder of his room there was one hallowed corner within which were hanging from a nail a stylish frock-coat, vest and trousers. A top hat, gloves and a cane kept them in countenance. When he walked abroad, clothed in these garments, he looked the man of fashion, doing the block and smiling on the fair. Conder loved pretty ladies in beautiful dresses, and afternoon tea with these attractions was for him a high feast, a sort of sacred cult. A few of us, Fulwood, Mahoney, Minns, Hopkins, and Phil May, had a weekly meeting for the purpose of drawing and talking over Australian art and its future, when Minns, who shared Conder's rooms during his stay in New South Wales, brought him along to this symposium. He quickly made friends, for he was of a simple and affectionate nature. As he was the youngest amongst us, he looked up to us with humility, which is a form of flattery very difficult to withstand. So it was that Charles Conder began to bring his little 9x5s to our weekly meetings, and very charming many of them were. I remember that about that time Fulwood took a craze for palette knife painting. Of course Conder must try it, and it is curious to see in Sir Baldwin Spencer's excellent collection of Australian pictures a small Conder which was painted in that fashion for our weekly meeting. We all used to lecture him more or less seriously upon the necessity of more methodical study. But Conder hated method of any sort, and the only occasion upon which I ever knew him to apply himself seriously to the study of nature was when he stayed with me at an old inn just beyond Richmond Bridge for 4 or 5 weeks in the spring of 1888. I had persuaded him to join me to see the spring blossoms around Windsor and Richmond, and we settled upon this somewhat disreputable old house of call as our headquarters. Here Conder set himself seriously to tackle the problems of form, colour and light. For a month a little procession started from the inn each morning, a girl leading a calf, and Conder, with his canvas and painting materials, following. The calf, which has so inconspicuous a place in the reproduction of his picture which illustrates these recollections, was a source of much irritation to Conder. When he had nearly painted it standing up, it would lie down. When he had coaxed it up, its head would be where its tail had hung. But the rest of the subject was not so intractable, and gradually, for Conder was a very slow worker, the beautiful hills and sky, the lovely tones of the blossom, the painstaking drawing of the gnarled old fruit trees, and the warm and beautiful colour of the foreground, made up the only truly Australian picture I have known Conder to paint. We came back to Sydney together. For a few months he was often in our midst, and at the end of that year, 1888, he went over to Melbourne, after having lived in New South Wales for 3 years. In 1890 he left Melbourne for Europe, and in 1909 this greatly gifted colourist and designer, with his dreams of romance and fêtes galantes, passed beyond our view. Since then, much has been written about Charles Conder. Injudicious admirers, in their desire to do honour to a very original artist, have published, with beautiful examples of his manner, some invitation cards, illustrations, and lithographs which injure his claim to fame. It is inexplicable that Conder the colourist could ever have been induced to attempt anything requiring draftsmanship, which is the very foundation upon which illustration or lithography must always rest. For colour harmony, and a fanciful, if somewhat artificial, sense of design, his taste was unerring, but his vague and capricious dreams had nothing in common with the severity and calculated beauty of form required in the work he attempted. To extol his genius for the fine things it gave us is well. To claim for that genius our admiration for qualities it never possessed only injures it. This is but one way in which Conder has suffered in the hands of his friends. It is quite a common statement that he was greatly indebted to Streeton for his artistic outlook. In truth, it was quite the other way. Conder, who only met Streeton towards the end of 1888, had at once a very powerful and easily recognisable effect upon the realistic treatment which marked the early work of Streeton. Realism at no time had any charm for Charles Conder. Colour and decorative effects were the goals he strove to attain. It was from Conder that Streeton learned the value of decorative landscape, and through his influence he began to lay more stress upon selection and design. I do not doubt but that Arthur Streeton would be amongst the first to acknowledge his debt to this gifted friend of his early manhood. Poor Conder! His early death deprived the world of art of many beautiful examples of his fantastic and original genius. But it is pleasant to think that his 5 years' sojourn in Australia laid the foundation for those colour poems, those charming medleys of pearly blossom and azure skies, upon which his claim to a place amongst the immortals must be based. End of Part 2.